Hey guys, welcome back to the Make Heaven Crowded podcast. We're a faith-based podcast. We talk all things life, faith, and Jesus. My name's Taylor, and I'm the host of this podcast. And today we're just going to jump right into it. So we're going to be in Matthew 14 today. And so to give you a little bit of context around what we're going to be reading, Matthew 14 starts off with John the Baptist being in prison. John the Baptist had been sent to prison because John called out Herod's sin with his brother-in-law's wife, and Herod then put John in prison, and then John was eventually beheaded in prison. Jesus found that John was eventually killed in prison, and then Jesus hears the news, and so he decides and that he wants to go and spend some time alone. And so as he's leaving to go to be alone, but 5,000 men showed up, and Jesus had compassion on them, and he instead taught them, fed them. Right after that is where we're going to pick up for today, and that is in Matthew 14:22 through 36, and it says this. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up to the mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from the land, buffeted by the waves because of the wind against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake, and when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come out on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got out of the boat, walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink, crying out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him, saying, "You have little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down, and those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." So this is honestly one of my favorite stories in the New Testament, because, there was so much happening in just such a short span. Jesus had just heard about John's death, and he wanted to go spend some time alone to grieve his cousin. And this crowd shows up, and Jesus has compassion on them. This is the very essence of who our God is. He had compassion on them, and instead of sending them away, he then decides, "I'm going to teach you guys, and then we are going to and then I'm going to feed you, and then I'll dismiss you." And so Jesus did that, and then immediately after the crowd was dismissed, Jesus went to spend some time alone in prayer. And one of the things that really sticks out to me is the fact that Jesus always made it a point to go and be alone with the Father. And I think this is something that we skip out a lot on as Christians, of just spending time alone with the Father. And whether it's just sitting there and reading your Bible, or just sitting and praying, or sitting in worship, I think it's something we neglect a lot as Christians, because I think sometimes we think we're too busy, or we get too caught up in all of these things going on. But Jesus made it a point that even though there was all this crazy stuff going around him, that he was healing people, John the Baptist was beheaded, and there's 5,000 people that came out and followed him, Jesus still made it a point to go and be alone with the Father. And so I think that's something that we as Christians should work on. I know it's something that I definitely need to continue to grow in, is being alone with the Father, because honestly, that is the time that that is just a time of intimacy with Christ, if that makes sense, because it's just this time of where it's just you and him, and you're working on growing your relationship with the Lord. Because ultimately, if you're dating someone, you're not going to just not hang out with them and not spend time with them, because you're never going to get to know them, right? Same thing in a friendship. You're not going to do any of that stuff because you're not going to get to know them. And so it's just this reminder of our relationship with the Lord should just be like that, because it is a friendship. It is a relationship with the Lord. And so it should be of where we are taking our time from our busy schedule. We're setting time aside so that we can be in the presence of the Lord. But one of the things I've never noticed is the fact that it was Peter's idea to go out on the water with Jesus. I always thought that it was Jesus's idea. But we see that Peter cried out, saying, "Lord, if it is you," Peter replied, "Tell me to come to you on the water." It was Peter's idea to go out on the water with Jesus. Peter was going to take this step of faith and to walk. He was going to take this step of faith and to walk on the water with Jesus. But we all know how it goes next, right? That then Peter then got caught up with the wind and the waves and became afraid and began to sink. The moment he took his eyes off of Jesus, he began to sink. And I think this is something as Christians that we do all the time. The minute we take our eyes off the Lord, things start going harder. I feel like you just start taking things in a way that you wouldn't if you had your eyes focused upon the Lord. Because let me tell you guys, the minute I take my eyes off of the Lord are the moments that I feel the most insecure, the moments I feel the most anxious, the moments I feel like the worst about myself is the moments that I take my eyes off of the Lord. And it's the moment that I feel the worst about my circumstances around me and all of these things. When I take my eyes off the Lord, I'm no longer focused in on what the Lord would like me to do. I'm then focused in upon of what I want. And so it is this reminder that we have to have our eyes fixed on Christ. You know, it doesn't matter whether or not you have followed the Lord for a long time or not. If you take your eyes off the Lord, you're gonna sink, because the wind and the waves of this world, the trials and storms of this world are going to become too strong for you to carry. And when you walk with the Lord gives you peace and he helps you walk through these circumstances. And without that, we begin to sink. That's just something that when I was reading it this week in my devotions, I was like, man, this really blew my mind, because like I said, I always thought that it was Jesus's idea for Peter to go out on the waves, but it wasn't. It was Peter's idea. He stepped out in faith, took his eyes off of Jesus, and began to sink. And I think sometimes we do that as well. You know, we'll step out in faith, but then in the middle of our step out in faith, we take our eyes off the Lord and we begin to sink. I know for me, there have been times where I try to step out in faith, but then it becomes less about the Lord and more about how I feel and how I look. And then I begin to become anxious or stressed out about what this person's thinking about me. And it's like, it doesn't matter what they're thinking about you. We just have to keep our eyes focused upon the Lord. One of my other favorite things about this story is the fact that Jesus caught Peter, right? Jesus didn't just leave him. He wasn't just like, you took your eyes off me, now you're going to sink in this water, and that's just the way it goes. Jesus instead reaches out and grabs Peter's hand and was like, why did you doubt? Why did you doubt me? And it just kind of shows the kind of God we serve, guys. Not only did Jesus say that Peter could give him this step out in faith, but then Jesus then caught Peter when he took his eyes off of him. And when he began to sink, Jesus doesn't just leave you in the pits. He is there with you, and he's given us his spirit to be there with us as well. It's also this idea, because Peter cried out to the Lord as he began to sink, and he's like, Lord, save me. And Jesus did save him. But it's also this idea that God saved you out of the pits of whatever you've been in before, right? He pulled you out of your anxiety, your depression, your anger, your bitterness, your whatever it is, whatever addiction habits you have, whatever it is, the Lord pulled you out of that before. And the Lord is still right there walking with you through things, even when you don't feel him. Because if we're being honest, for a long time when I was still in my lukewarm season, I was like, I don't feel the Lord. I don't feel the Lord. Well, you're not always going to feel the Lord. It's not about just feelings. Love isn't just about feelings, right? My pastor put it this way: when you're married to someone and you love them, you have to continually choose to love them, even in the difficult moments. You have to choose to love them when you're arguing. You have to choose to love them when they're making you really upset. You have to choose to love these people in the moments that you don't want to love them. And that's exactly how it is with our walk with the Lord. You have to constantly choose to love the Lord in the moments that you don't feel like it, in the moments that you don't feel like you feel the Lord. You still have to choose to be obedient and to love the Lord in those moments. And because it's about obedience. It's not just about feelings, because not everything we feel in this world is true. Because in Jeremiah, it tells us that the heart is deceitful above all things. Who can understand it, right? And so if our heart is so deceitful, why are we trusting every little feeling it's giving us? Because that's something I do a lot. And it's something that the Lord has definitely worked on in my heart, and I'm still learning. But we can't trust every little thing that our mind tells us, because we think that everything we feel is valid. And there's going to be an episode podcast on that, because I could talk about it all day. But not everything you feel is true, because there are times where, in my head, I am just I don't know, all of a sudden I become so insecure for no reason. I'll literally just be standing there, and all of a sudden I just become really insecure about the way I look, the way I act, the way I talk, whatever. And then I feel insecure for a while, and then I go and I read my Bible, and all of a sudden I'm like, the Lord loves me. He chose me. He redeemed me. He pulled me out of things I never could have gotten myself out of, and things that I never thought I could get out of. So why on earth am I trusting what I feel over what the Word of God says? Next week's episode's on Not Everything You Feel is Valid. We're going back to our story here in Matthew. They then climbed out of the boat, or climbed into the boat, and the wind died down. And we see this before in Matthew and in the other Gospels, that Jesus had calmed the wind and the waves. And it just goes to show you the power that the Lord has. Like, I think sometimes I start to forget what the Lord can do. And reading this, I'm like, oh, wait, the Lord has power over the wind, over the waves, over the weather, over every little thing moving on this world. The Lord has power over all of it. And so that was just a really cool reminder to me, too, that sometimes I feel like sometimes I feel like I want to be in control more than the Lord's in control. And I'm like, wait, but the Lord's in control. Like, He's in control of every little thing, detail on this world. The way the wind blows, the way the clouds moves, the way the earth rotates and doesn't get too far from the sun, but doesn't get too close to the sun. Like, the Lord is constantly in control, and it is incredible. But the main point of this week's episode, I just want to reiterate it, is we cannot get caught up in the wind and the waves of this world and allow it to take our eyes off the Lord. In those moments that we begin to struggle with whatever it is, whatever wind, whatever wave it is that you're facing, in those moments, instead of running from the Lord, turn to the Lord. Because in those moments that you are feeling those things about whatever you are feeling or whatever you are going through, in those moments, turn to the Lord, because the Lord will give you peace. The Lord is right there walking with you through it. But the minute you turn from the Lord and you take your eyes off the Lord, the bigger your problems seem. And sometimes they're not as big as they seem. The problem is you took your eyes off the Lord, and sometimes they are as big as they seem. But then you have the Lord to walk through it with you. He is right there with you, and He is walking through it with you. He loves you. That's going to be it for this week's episode. Thank you guys so much for tuning in to this week's episode of the Make Heaven Crowded podcast, and I hope to see you guys on the next one.